της ΣΥΚ, όπως και του ΛΥΜΕΚ, κάναμε μια ιστορική αναδρομή για την οργάνωση των κομμάτων, αλλά και μας έδωσαν και πάρα πολλές και πρακτικές ιδέες για το πώς μπορούμε αντίστοιχα και εμείς σαν ένα νέο κοινωνικά φιλελεύθερο κόμμα να οργανωθούμε και να επεκταθούμε. Σήμερα έχουμε ένα εξαιρετικό πάνελ. Το θέμα μας, όπως πάντα, είναι το πώς θα μπορέσουμε να δώσουμε διεξόδους για να βγούμε από την κρίση στην οποία βρισκόμαστε. Το πρωί, λοιπόν, πήραμε όλη αυτή την βάση για το τι σημαίνει ο κοινωνικά φιλελεύθερος χώρος και μάθαμε, ακριβώς είδαμε πώς η ιστορία έχει τα πάνω της και τα κάτω της. Οι P66 λοιπόν γράψανε την δική τους ιστορία και τώρα καλείται και η κοινωνία αξιών αντίστοιχα να γράψει τη δική της ιστορία. Θέλουμε να δώσουμε την αίσθηση ότι οτιδήποτε μπορεί να γίνει καλό σε αυτόν τον τόπο μπορεί να γίνει μόνο με συνεργασίες και με όραμα. Γι' αυτό λοιπόν και έχουμε όλους τους εξαίρετους καλεσμένους σήμερα να μας δώσουν τη δική τους θέση πάνω σε διαφορετικά θέματα. Και θα ήθελα να κάνω τις πρώτες συστάσεις και μετά θα αναφερθούμε στο καθένα ξεχωριστά για τι θέμα θα μιλήσει. Θα ολοκληρώσουν τις παρουσιάσεις που θα είναι γύρω στα 15 με 20 λεπτά ο καθένας ή και λιγότερο όποιος αισθάνεται καλύτερα με αυτό. Και μετά θα ακολουθήσουν ερωτήσεις και συζήτηση. Λοιπόν, πρώτα λοιπόν θα μας μιλήσει ο κύριος Απόστολος Δοξιάδης, ο οποίος είναι συγγραφέας και σκηνοθέτης, όπως όλοι ξέρουμε, και θα μας αναπτύξει το θέμα τι θα μπορούσε να σημαίνει ένα φιλελεύθερο κόμμα σήμερα. Στη συνέχεια το λόγο θα πάρει ο κύριος Στέλιος Περάκης, καθηγητής Διεθνών και Ευρωπαϊκών Θεσμών στο Πάντιο Πανεπιστήμιο, και θα μας δώσει τη δική του, μια δικαϊκή προσέγγιση στην ευρωπαϊκή ολοκλήρωση. Θα συνεχίσει ο κύριος Γιάν Φεστέχ, αν λέω σωστά το όνομα, όπου θα δώσει θα μιλήσει για την Ευρώπη και την Ελλάδα από την οπτική γωνιά ενός ξένου που γνωρίζει την Ελλάδα εμπειρικά. Στη συνέχεια θα μας μιλήσει η κυρία Τζεσίν Μάισνερ, ευρωβουλευτής του FDP και μέλος του ALDE Group. Και στο τέλος θα κλείσουμε με την κυρία Ευγενία Βαρτάκου, συντονίστρια του προγράμματος Εργαστήριου Πολιτικής από το Πανεπιστήμιο Πελοποννήσου, με θέμα από τον κοινωνικό διάλογο στη συλλογική δράση, ευκαιρίες και προκλήσεις στην εποχή της κρίσης. Και βεβαίως θα κλείσει την εκδήλωση ο κύριος Μπουραντάς, που είναι ο πρώτος κοινωνίας αξιών, για μας μιλήσει για τις επερχόμενες ευρωεκλογές στην Ελλάδα. Θα δώσω λοιπόν το λόγο στον κύριο Απόστολο Δοξιάδη και θα θέλαμε μέσα από όλη αυτή την εμπειρία που έχετε όλα αυτά τα χρόνια να μας πείτε ποια θεωρείτε ότι είναι τα συστατικά ενός φιλελεύθερου κόμματος στην Ελλάδα. Όχι γενικά όπως το ξέρουμε στη θεωρία για το φιλελευθερισμό. Ναι.
Να μιλήσω αγγλικά, οπότε θεωρώ ότι αν και έχουμε. Στα αγγλικά δεν έχουμε. Από ελληνικά αγγλικά δεν έχουμε, αλλά θεωρώ ότι οι μισοί ομιλητές μιλάνε αγγλικά, όλοι έχουν έρθει να είναι αγγλικά. So, good evening. I was asked originally to, good to be here. I was asked originally to speak on mapping the Greek liberal landscape. I don't know why I was chosen as an expert on this. I think because I'm a writer and writers are jacks of all trades and masters of none, I could possibly contribute something to this too. I would like to rephrase this, the mapping, although I'd like the notion of mapping, to rephrase this as what could a liberal Greek party be like to be effective. Now, as a writer, I guess it is rather considered obvious usually when I speak about anything but writing that I will speak as a dreamer but as there are too many dreamers in the Greek political scene, I'd rather speak like a realist. And there is an element of realism to a writer, because a writer is a storyteller, and a storyteller operates by situating a story in a context, in a where and a now, in a particular place and time. And so I would like to try and understand what's going on here and now. And I think that's what we should start from. Ancient Greek rhetoricians, Aristotle called this the kairos, the time, and he defined it as the most important dimension of rhetoric, knowing where you're speaking, to whom you're speaking, and why you're speaking. So, trying to answer that question, in a perfect world, we would speak about ideas, principles, and methods. What ideas and what principles should the Liberal Party have, and what methods with which to implement it. And I'm speaking this way, in sort of in vacuo, as if beginning from zero, or above all, I should say, since I'm using Latin, because we are speaking not about an existing structure, but a new tendency, a creation, really, of a Greek liberal center space. But this, our world, not just Greece, the world is far from perfect, so it doesn't make so much sense to jump directly into principles and directions, but one should first speak about diagnostically and see what the situation we are like is now, how far the world differs from being perfect. And a country has its own idiosyncrasies, like any country, and as also we have our non-Greek friends here, and I was also asked to speak, partly addressing myself to them. I think it's perhaps, very happy to hear the Dutch ambassador give his outsider's view. I will try and give you an insider's view, of my own. It may be wrong, of course, but it's at least I live here. And perhaps because of that, of familiarity, there are many things I don't see, but as I tend to look at history a lot, I think I may be also noticing a few things. Now, one of the most characteristic things that we have to say about this moment, by the rhetorical kairos, is that we are speaking in a country which is not only particular, like any country in any time, but also a country in crisis. And this crisis certainly affects the picture. It puts on special constraints and special problems that would not be there normally. And I think the most important thing that happens in a country in a crisis, and one of the least intuitive things, one of the things that one would least expect, is that the notion of the obvious changes. All of us live our lives accepting things as obvious, either in our human nature, or in our society, or in our country, or in our era. We think that our mortality is obvious, and we think that taxes are obvious, the height is to be determined, and we think that this is obvious, and civilized manners of a certain degree are obvious. But in a society in crisis, especially, the sense of the obvious changes, and the sense of the obvious is also culturally determined. So to speak about Greece of today, I would begin by defining three basic things that, although they might be obvious to Greeks of other times, or to enlightened Greeks thinking of a perfect world, or to a Western European, are not at all obvious in the political scene today in Greece. The first is the rule of law. Rule of law has a specific meaning to a citizen of the Western world today, as to the rights of the citizens and the limitations and the obligations of the state. That is not true in Greece at the moment, and has not been true for quite some time. Greeks know well what we mean by clientelism, or patronage, or rousfeti, or penadiakes cases in Greek. And those friends of ours from abroad who are coming to know us are understanding it, or are reading about it. It is a very real situation in Greece. It is not characteristic of a very Western European state, and that certainly affects the rule of law. And although there is a human aspect to a lot that was there in Greek society in the past that still survives in the sense of the small scale, the personal relationship, it is rather incompatible or very incompatible with the notion of a modern state. And so, in a time of crisis, rule of law becomes much less obvious and much more of a need. The second principle that is not obvious is Max Weber's famous dictum of that the state holds the monopoly of violence. In a good society, or good enough society, if I'm allowed to use that expression, the state does indeed possess the monopoly of violence, which it exercises moderately and with prudence and within the rule of law, so as not to go into totalitarianism or a dictatorial situation or authoritarianism, but also it does exercise it, because otherwise we go to chaos and anarchy. The difference between these two extremes, authoritarianism and anarchy, is extremely confused in Greece, and you will see the rhetoric of politicians, active and popular politicians, some insisting that we are in a state of authoritarian control by the government, the others insisting that we are in a state of anarchy, and sometimes with no apparent contradiction between these two. So there is a very difficult sense of us understanding what the monopoly of violence means. And speaking of Max Weber, who to me still defines better than any one of the great thinkers the situation of the Western democracies, modern democracies, one of his wiser things, I think he says, is that politics, the function of politics, is to exist as a counterbalance to the authority of the bureaucracy. Now, this is something that the Greek could not have said, could not have invented. The German, much more logically, or a Western European, because this was invented in a country where bureaucracy was older than politics, where you had big central states and which had developed bureaucracy to be ruled effectively. And then, with democracy, politicians entered the game and elected government. But in Greece, the relationship of bureaucracy to politics, and by bureaucracy here, let me just define the state sector, the public sector, the state administration, is infernally confused and has become even more so in the past 30 years by what we call in Greece, I think very aptly, komatokratia, as in demokratia, the rule of the demos, the many, but the city, the community, but komatokratia, the rule of the parties. And we have an unholy triad in modern Greek politics, not just of the crisis, but before, of the parties, the public sector, and the unions of the public sector, not unions in general, which has created a very lethal mixture, which makes it extremely difficult to effect any change. And if one thinks, as I do, that the general direction of being in agreement with the mnemonia, the loan agreement that we are living with for the past 4 years, is a good direction, a correct direction, many Greeks with me of this persuasion also believe that the government is doing the wrong things in the sense of only trying to solve problems by raising taxes or taxing even more the private sector or those who pay the taxes anyway. And all this is not or either of intent or inability to extricate itself from the unholy triad. Now, if I try to list what I did now by these three non-obvious things that told is gave a picture of what is going on right now. But if we try and look at it historically, and I think that is also an interesting exercise, I think if you want to locate a party in a political space, you have to define the space first. A party is a voice, and the voice feels a vacuum, feels a need. That the politics in democracy is like a play, and a party is one of the players. So what is the obvious, to see what is the obvious role for such a party to play, one wants to understand the stagecraft. And traditionally, after the French Revolution, the right-left line and the in-betweeners has defined for many people the political scene, this is not really enough to understand the political scene. I think we can separate the Greek 20th century modernity, let us call it, political modernity, the last 100 years, in roughly three cleavages from the early 20th century until 1940, until the Second World War. It was the conservative, which was always identified with royalist, versus the progressive or anti-royalist. And this defined politics. From 1940 until the end of the junta, the 7-year junta in 74, on to that was added, this was not replaced, this was always there, on to that was added the communist, non-communist cleavage. And after the end of the collapse of the junta, and especially after the 1980s, we started to have a confusion of criteria. This meant that politics became increasingly apolitical and a-ideological, and politics of the ideological type began to function more and more as a decoration, and a decoration that in public rhetoric was expressed in a populist dimension. So it was an apolitical, I would say that the basic cleavage became clientelist. It was almost like a football cleavage of, I don't know the equivalents in other countries, but here we'll say Panathinaikos, Olympiakos, historically two big football clubs. The two parties, although nominally center-right and center-left, which shared almost 90% of the vote, we had essentially a two-party system, were really ideologically very similar, and their networks were clientelist, and the differences purely rhetorical. Now, this changed in 2009, after the economic crisis started, and what we call in Greece mnemonio, the memorandum of agreement, of the loan agreement, has made a new, very definite cleavage, which we may not like, but is there. And many people who subscribe to the one camp, especially to the pro-agreement, the mnemoniaki, don't like the term, as I don't. And so we have those for or those against the agreement. Mind you, no one is against the loan itself, no one is against the money. It's just against the conditions for accepting it. The anti-agreement party, I would say, is side, which comprises the right and left, and that's why those cleavages don't really matter very much. I would say extremes of both sides. Is shamelessly, I'll call it populist, in the sense that it proposes no counter solutions. It proposes a dream world, a la-la land of hopes and miracles rather than solutions. The pro-agreement party on the side, as expressed in the present governmental coalition, has, I would say, a total confusion of criteria and absence of plans. And it is here that the deep pathologies of Greek political life that a liberal party, an ex-party, a party that could appear, should address. Because I think that by its nature, a liberal party is more or less coordinated to the ideas, to the anti-populism expressed in the pro-agreement side, and it could not be anywhere else by a sort of reductio ad absurdum. But in this landscape, there is a definite crisis and void vacuum of ideas that should be addressed, and also vacuum voices. Now, I should say that if I'm speaking of a theoretically new, of a theoretical liberal party, not of a perfect liberal party, because we are talking politics, not of a good even liberal party, but a good enough liberal party, I think that in a moment of crisis, one has to be very careful not to put an overemphasis on principles and ideology, but to have very, very few and very, very clear principles, ideally just one. Because the problem, if you're going to have a big, nice manifesto with everything exactly mapped out, and I've seen about 20 of those in the past 5 years of 20 different parties, is that you risk like a small groupuscule of the left to be totally right and totally alone. And in politics, if you're totally alone, you're not a politician. You have votes also, and these have to come from the people in a democracy. So I think there should be one big idea. One big idea is required only: liberalism as a reaction to statism. And we have a lot of sick statism in Greece of all different varieties. Liberalism, to my mind, should be assertion of individual rights and their defense from their enemies, and their enemies can be seen by the three principles I applied before, for example, with the monopoly of violence. And violence, I don't mean just beating people or putting them in jail, but the violence of inhibiting life as usual of other people, the rights of other people, say, to go to university, okay, because of an active minority that is against that and wants to shut down the universities. So it would be an assertion of individual rights and an assertion that goes against those both private interest groups that want to go against them and the state itself when it wants to impose itself on citizens beyond a certain degree. For example, and this shows you how well the misapprehensions prevalent in the rhetoric go around, I would say that the biggest short joke we can say today is that the government is exercising neoliberal politics. And the anti-loan agreement side constantly says that, but I think if Milton Friedman heard that, he would spin into it. So one big idea is enough. Liberalism as a reaction to a prevailing statism. And apart from that, I would just finish by stating three very brief principles, which to my mind, very practical, because you have to be practical, which such a party should follow at the level of party work, of political work, of the work done, let me say, by party cadres or professional politicians, whatever, but people devoted to being active participants. So let me just call it by political elites. This party should strive for union. It is ridiculous to go alone. There are about 20 or 30 tiny parties, some less than tiny but small ones, and very strong, very important liberally minded groups, organized or not organized, in the two or three bigger parties. So I think at the level of elite politics, one should go for unity, and that should be the main goal of forces. At the level of grassroots politics or activism, one should go for a new rhetoric, an idea of making the non-obvious the non-obvious, or the other way around, going back to the obvious. And I think there is an awful lot of need of that. A lot of it is done, I should say. One of the good things of the crisis in Greece is that many people, intellectuals, bloggers, artists, have begun to acquire an involvement in the public sphere and to speak of things in a way which is refreshing and interesting. But I would say that those ideas have to be spread, and in a way which also partakes, do not misunderstand me please, of a small element of benign populism. The ideas have to be expressed in a language that can be communicated in a society corrupted and by populism. And the last thing is that we have to realize that in a perfect world we would have would be ruled first by philosopher kings. We don't have those. In a less than perfect world we would need to have some, would be ruled by parties of principles, and we cannot afford that because principles are very weak voiced faced with strong interest groups and strong charismatic personalities. Those of us who are puzzled by the rise of the party of Syriza, almost 30% at the moment, should never forget. I am totally positive of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. That one of its main reasons for its huge rise is the personality and, I stress, the age of its leader. So I think that the affair to rejuvenate our politics should be done by younger people. I think that such a party should be the platform that gives voice and power to people in their 30s and their 40s, who can have some experience of life and a wish to start anew. And of course, us older folks should not be exterminated perhaps, but used to help, to assist, to promote ideas. But I think it is, if you look at the demographics of the last election, you have, unlike, if Marx was, I would heard this, he too would spin in his grave, but you have a case of almost zero class cleavage, but a huge age cleavage of young people voting completely differently from older people. And I think that unless one is represented by persons, because Greek politics is very personalized by young persons in such a group, such a party, it is bound to fail. So I think that us, older folks, should be facilitators and mediators, but that at the center of liberal politics should be younger people. That is all. Thank you.